the dust followed her like shame. Long and slow, the trail she walked bore no sound but the faint shuffle of bare soles on scorched dirt. Jean May's feet were cracked and blistered beneath the hem of her faded blue dress, once a wedding gown, now a threadbare echo of what had been. Her infant daughter clung to her breast in slumber, cheek pressed to collarbone, limp from hunger. Jean did not cry. She hadn't cried since the day they closed her late husband's coffin with a hammer and 4 rusted nails. After that, the tears had dried somewhere between her throat and pride. The Comanche camp was still at dawn. Smoke rose from low fires. Horses whinnied softly in the distance. And there he stood, taller than she expected, broader in shoulder, with a silence not empty but full, like Riverstone. He wore no headdress, no war markings, just the calm of someone who had buried love with his hands and still fed the fire out of duty. His name, she'd heard in whispers, was Chaska. 30. Widowed, like her. Father of twins born 3 moons too early. Their mother bled out before naming them, and it was said he hadn't spoken since. Jean didn't offer words when she stopped at the edge of his land. Words had done nothing in court when her in-laws took her daughter. Words hadn't fed her stomach. She simply reached into her satchel, unwrapped the cloth from her breast, and revealed the swaddled girl sleeping there, then looked down at her chest and then up at him. He nodded once. Just once. Then turned his back and walked toward the low cabin nestled between cottonwoods. She followed. That was how it began. The cradle inside was carved from cedar, split for 2, but the infants lay side by side, their cheeks red from heat and hunger. Jean undid her buttons with a tired grace, like prayer, and knelt. The cabin went still. The babies latched to her like roots to water. Chaska watched her from the doorway. No gratitude, no suspicion, just watching. Perhaps he saw what others would not, that she had been feeding other people's children since she was 13, that her husband had never let her nurse their own daughter, claiming it ruined a woman's figure, and that shame had made a ghost of her. Perhaps he saw none of it. Perhaps he just saw milk and silence. She did not ask for a bed, but he laid a blanket near the hearth. She slept curled around her daughter like a question mark. The twins whimpered at dawn, her body knew their cries before they rose. By the 3rd day, she learned to tell them apart by the shape of their ears. The girl had a mole behind her left lobe. The boy, a stubborn silence. When she nursed them together, her own daughter tucked between her legs, the room filled with a peace she had not known in years. And still, Chaska said little. He mended fence posts. He chopped wood. He brought water and sometimes left fresh tobacco leaves on the windowsill. Once, she caught him watching her comb her hair and he turned away so fast, he hit his head on the beam. It wasn't affection, not yet. But it was something softer than duty. When Jean went to town to fetch cloth and soap, ice followed her like flies. The general store clerk refused to look her in the eye. A preacher's wife leaned close and whispered, "Heathen's milk spoils the soul, you know." Jean didn't answer. She bought a spool of red thread. It reminded her of her daughter's ribbon, the one Delilah wore the day she was taken from her arms while Jean stood trial for emotional instability. Her husband's parents never approved of her. She wasn't obedient enough. They said no woman should speak when her husband was speaking, and Jean had dared to laugh in church once. Now they had her child, and the law had nodded politely and said, "Best for the girl." Back at the cabin, Chaska was repairing the saddle straps. Jean returned without meeting his eye and scrubbed her hands 3 times before picking up the children. Her own daughter asked, "Mama, what does spoiled mean?" and Jean smiled the way people do when their mouths forget how to move. That night, the camp nearby held a drum circle. Jean listened from a distance as she stitched by firelight. The twins slept belly up. Her daughter hummed and traced stars into the dirt with a stick. Chaska brought her a bowl of stew and sat down across from her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wind spoke instead, rustling the cottonwood leaves like paper being turned. Weeks passed. Jean became part of the rhythm of the land. She knew when to harvest berries and when to add goat milk to stretch her own. She washed the cloth diapers with lye and left them on the bush to bleach. Her hands grew strong again. The twins began to smile when she entered the room. And Chaska began to leave things near her bed, a carved wooden rattle, a dried cornhusk doll, a comb made of bone. He never gave them directly. Just left them where her hands would find them. Then one day, as the sun broke through low cloud and bled gold over the prairie, Jean sat on the porch with her nursing shawl loose, feeding both the twins. Her daughter was plaiting grass at her feet. Chaska approached, holding something in his hand, awkward, as if unused to the gesture. It was a ribbon. Faded red. He knelt beside Delilah, tied it into her hair with fumbling fingers, and said, softly, "This belongs with her." Jean didn't speak. But her throat swelled. Her heart, too. Later that night, while folding the laundry, Jean found a sliver of wood carved with her daughter's name. She held it against her chest and breathed deep, like someone finally remembering how. Outside, Chaska was feeding the fire. The stars hung quiet above them both. The silence between them was not the kind that follows loss anymore, it was the kind that comes before something begins. And that was how the milk in the silence became something holy. Something new. Something neither of them dared to name. Not yet. But something the children already knew. Because the girl twin had begun to giggle when Jean hummed. And the boy twin now clung to her shawl even after feeding. And Delilah, who used to cry herself to sleep, now slept holding one of the twins' tiny hands. Jean looked out into the distance, where night met land, and whispered to the dark, "Please don't take this, too." She didn't know that trouble was already on its way. But for now, there was warmth. There was silence. And milk enough to keep them all alive. The town of Dustwell wore its judgments plain. Slanted glances, half-hidden whispers, and the brittle silence that trailed a woman like Jean May down every dry-plank sidewalk. Her boots were clean but worn through at the sole, and her shoulders carried more weight than her frame suggested. She held Delilah's old ribbon in her hand like a relic, twisted between her fingers until it frayed into threads. Beside her, a burlap sack of baby linen swayed against her hip as she walked toward the general store. She passed the church first. A bell tolled without grace, and the preacher's wife, Mrs. Ida Gray, stood at the stoop arranging flowers into vases too fine for such dust. She paused when she saw Jean. Her gaze skimmed down Jean's form like a needle through cloth and landed on her empty left hand. The one that no longer held a child. "You don't even have your daughter anymore," Mrs. Gray said, loud enough for the wind to carry it. Jean didn't stop walking. She couldn't. If she did, the ache might catch up with her and swallow her whole. Inside the store, Mr. Pike wouldn't meet her eye. He counted the eggs she'd brought from Chaska's coop without a word, dropped a few sticks of lye soap onto the counter, and nodded toward the door. No change was given. None asked for. Outside, a group of ranch wives whispered under the shade of the hitching post. One laughed and nudged the other. She wet nurse's redskins now, bless her heart. Jean's jaw clenched, but she kept her eyes on the road, and her hands loose at her sides. Her fingers twitched where they once would have curled around Delilah's. But Delilah wasn't here. Not since the court gave her away like she was a dish that didn't match the set. The memory of that courtroom still scratched inside Jean like a splinter in bone. Her late husband's parents, stiff-backed and righteous, spoke of mental unwellness and cultural confusion. They'd called her unfit because she hummed lullabies from her grandmother's people, used poultices instead of pills, and refused to slap her child when she wouldn't sit still in church. The judge hadn't looked at Jean once while he ruled. Just tapped the gavel, murmured something about proper Christian guardianship, and handed her baby girl to a woman who never wanted her, only the inheritance that came with her name. Now Jean stitched clothes for 3 babies who weren't hers, boiled bottles, sang in a tongue her grandmother taught her, and lived in a cabin where silence was the closest thing to love she'd ever known. Chaska never asked about Delilah. But one night, after the children had been fed and wrapped in quilts, he stood near the door, his arms crossed, and said, "Your daughter." She was 4? Jean looked up from her mending, surprised. Yes. Hair like a crow's wing. Temper like a mule. A faint flicker of a smile touched his lips. It disappeared just as quick. He nodded. She should be here. She should, Jean said, her voice tight as thread pulled too fast through canvas. But they said I wasn't enough. Chaska stared at the fire. His voice was quieter than usual when he answered. People who lose love often confuse control for care. That was the longest sentence he'd spoken to her. The next morning, Jean found a handful of wildflowers laid on her windowsill. Bluebells. The kind her daughter used to pluck and hide in her apron. She touched them with 2 fingers and closed her eyes. As spring deepened, the twins grew louder, hungrier, stronger. The boy liked to crawl to the hearth and slap his hands on the floor just to hear the noise. The girl babbled at birds through the window. And Jean, for all her heartache, began to smile more often, even if only in her sleep. One evening, she brushed her hair by the fire. Chaska sat whittling a spoon nearby. He didn't look at her, but his hand slowed with each pass of the brush through her thick, dark curls. You should wear it down more often, he murmured. Jean's hand paused. And give them more to talk about? They already talk. He looked up then. Let them drown in it. It wasn't affection yet. But it was more than kindness. Still, she could feel the edge of something gathering. A storm not in the sky, but in the skin. That storm came 3 days later. Jean had gone to fetch cloth from Mrs. Hartley's barn. She paid with sewing work sometimes. As she rode back, she saw something that made her heart stop. Delilah. Her daughter. Standing in front of the schoolhouse, clutching a pale biscuit in both hands. Dirt on her cheeks. Eyes wide and dull. Jean didn't even think. She swung down from the horse and ran to her. Delilah, baby, it's Mama. But the child stepped back. I'm not supposed to talk to you, she said flatly. Papa and Nana said you're wicked. That you live with devils now. Jean dropped to her knees. I'm not wicked, baby. I'm right here. Delilah didn't move. Mrs. Gray appeared on the porch like a phantom, arms crossed. She's not yours anymore, Jean May. The law said so. Don't make a scene. Jean stood slowly. The sun felt like knives on her skin. She nodded once and walked away. But she didn't cry. Not until she got back to Chaska's and saw the girl twin reach for her, arms up, mouth forming a sound like ma. That night, Jean took her daughter's old dress from her trunk and stitched it into a blanket square. She added it to the quilt she was building, tiny, uneven pieces from all the children she'd cared for, patched together like a memory no one could tear away. Chaska didn't say a word when she placed it on the twins' cradle. But he did take her hand in his for the first time when the fire burned low and shadows danced on the walls. It was not a kiss. It was not a proposal. It was a promise, quiet and plain. You're not alone in this anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. But miles away, the Yarrows were already planning. They'd seen Jean watching their granddaughter. They'd seen the look in her eyes. And they would not allow her to bring shame to their name again. The past, like winter, was coming back around. But for now, Jean tucked the red ribbon beneath her pillow and held the girl twin close. The milk was warm. The silence was deep. But both were trembling. The rain came sudden that day, hot and hard, like a slap from heaven, and Jean stood barefoot on the porch with her arms crossed, watching the prairie turn silver. The sky cracked open in streaks, but she didn't flinch. Behind her, the twins giggled from their bedroll, tapping little palms against the window. A flash of red caught her eye. The ribbon. It had slipped from beneath her pillow and lay curled in the doorway like a snake. She picked it up, brushed off the dust, and stared out at the wild country that had become her refuge. In her mind, there was a room that remained dark. The one where Delilah should have been sleeping, tangled in her mother's quilts and babbling about frogs or pie or something too small to matter and too sweet to forget. But that room didn't exist here. Not in the cabin. Not in town. Only in Jean's heart, and it had gone hollow with waiting. The days had grown heavier. Not just the air, thick with heat and swarming flies, but the silence that filled every corner of the home when the children napped. Chaska noticed it too. He would look up from sharpening his blade or cleaning the hooves of the mare and glance at Jean like he meant to speak, but didn't. As though he knew her sorrow had no words. Only wait. One evening, she found herself sitting at the hearth long after the stew had cooled, her sewing forgotten on her lap. The fire had burned low, just enough to cast orange across the walls. That was when she heard it, small, nearly imagined. "Mama?" Her breath caught. She turned slowly. But it was the little Comanche girl, dreaming. Still, the ache had bloomed so suddenly that Jean nearly doubled over with it. She tucked the children in, one by one. Kissed their foreheads. Then, with the steadiness of someone unraveling, she walked out into the field where the earth met the sky and screamed. Not loud. Just enough for God to hear. The next morning, Chaska fixed the roof shingles without speaking. Jean boiled oats and didn't taste them. Delilah haunted every space between their glances. Chaska finally broke the silence. "I'll take you," he said, nodding toward town. "To where she is." Jean shook her head. "They won't even let me near her." "And if they do, what then?" "She's been told I'm wicked. That I abandoned her." "What if she believes them?" He watched her a moment. "You didn't abandon her. They stole her." Jean whispered, "That's not how it looks to a 4-year-old. The guilt was layered now, not just that her daughter had been taken, but that she might believe it was by choice. That her mother chose another family, another bed, another baby to feed. The quilt Jean had been piecing together now felt like a lie. She returned to it anyway, each stitch a prayer. One patch was cut from Delilah's old dress, the hem still stained with blackberry juice. Another from Chaska's discarded shirt sleeve. A baby blanket from one of the twins. Each piece soft with use. Loved. Claimed. But there was still a space she left open, a square of bare muslin near the center. It was meant for Delilah's hair ribbon. When? Not if. Weeks passed. One hot noon, Jean walked to town to trade soap and eggs. She kept her eyes low. But even then, she could feel them watching. Mrs. Gray was outside again, sweeping a porch that never seemed to gather dust. As Jean passed, the woman said sweetly, "They say the red man's twins call you Mama now. And yet your own won't even look at you." Jean stopped. She turned, slowly. "Better a red man's child who wants me than a white man's family who threw me out like rotted meat." Mrs. Gray's lips thinned to a line. "Your daughter won't know you soon. Then you'll have nothing." Jean met her stare, calm and tired and full of something unbreakable. "She'll know me when I come for her." Later, in the barn behind the store, Jean cried into the hay. Quiet and alone. The kind of cry that makes no sound, just trembles through the bones. When she returned home, her daughter's dress was missing from the quilt basket. She panicked, tore through every folded cloth. Nothing. But then she found it. On the back porch. Chaska was sitting beside it, mending a loose stitch. He looked up. "I didn't ask." Jean sat beside him. "I'm glad you didn't." They worked side by side as the sun lowered, each thread pulled tight across old fabric in new silence. Then he spoke, voice low. "The girl calls you Mama. I know. She doesn't cry like she used to. I know that too. And you," he paused. "You smile sometimes now." "I do." He took a breath, as if the words weighed more than he could hold. "But you don't laugh." "I haven't in a long time." He nodded. Said nothing else. The twins babbled behind the door. The boy tugged on the girl's hair and made her squeal. Jean stood and opened the door, letting their chaos spill out like music. That night, she laid out her daughter's dress across her lap and began embroidering the name Delilah in pale gold thread, slanted, a little uneven, but hers. Chaska watched her from the other side of the room. The fire cast his face in bronze and shadow. He didn't look away. "At last," he said, "when I was a boy, my brother drowned in a river trying to save a dog. My mother never took his bed down. She kept it made every morning. Dustless. Still. Like he might come back. Jean looked up. I used to think that was grief, Chaska continued. But now I think maybe it was hope. That kind you hold without saying. Jean set the needle down. Then I've got a whole room of hope, she whispered. A long pause passed between them, filled with the soft crackle of fire and the quiet snore of children. Finally, Chaska stood and walked to her. He knelt. Not to propose. Not to pray. Just to rest his forehead against her knee. And she let him. In that moment, they didn't belong to any town, any name, any law. They belonged only to the hollow places, his where a wife once slept, hers where a daughter should have. But they were no longer empty. They were becoming filled. Slowly. Fiercely. And together. Outside, the wind stirred the grass. And far across the plains, in a house built on judgment, a little girl stood at her window with her hands pressed to the glass and whispered, "Mama?" The prairie heard. And it remembered. The morning began like any other, sourdough rising on the windowsill, the twins kicking against one another on the quilt, and Jean humming as she ground cornmeal by hand. Sunlight slanted through the shutters, catching on the silver in her braid and the edge of the comb Chaska had carved for her. He'd left early to check the north fence. She'd watched him ride off, broad-shouldered and silent, his long shadow stretching across the dew-damp grass like a sentinel. Delilah had visited the day before. Just an hour. Just long enough for Jean to kneel in the dirt and press her daughter's small hands to her face, whispering, "Do you remember the river we used to visit? The way the frogs croaked after rain?" Delilah had blinked, unsure. She'd said, "I think I dreamed of it," and Jean's heart had cracked open like dry bark. That small, frail voice had filled her with more hope than the judge's ruling ever could. Jean had walked her back to the edge of the road, just where Mr. Yarrow waited in his wagon, arms crossed, eyes sharp with contempt. He hadn't said a word. Just tugged Delilah into the seat and snapped the reins without looking back. Now, with the bread rising and the corn nearly milled, Jean felt the stillness in her bones. A silence too heavy, too hollow. It wasn't just the usual quiet, this was something missing. She called her daughter's name. Not the twins. Delilah. Though she wasn't there. She shouldn't have been there. She should have still been with the Yarrows until the next visit. But Jean's body knew before her mind did. She stepped outside. A paper flapped against the porch post, pinned with a nail. Her hands trembled before she touched it. The words were sharp, slanted, angry. "We've taken her east. She won't be part of your savage experiment. Don't come looking." No signature. But she didn't need one. She dropped the note. Her breath caught. Her knees nearly gave way, but she clutched the porch beam and stayed upright. The twins began to cry inside. But she couldn't move. Her daughter had been taken again, and this time, they weren't coming back. By the time Chaska returned, Jean had packed a sack. No food. No rest. Just Delilah's ribbon and the quilt with her name stitched in the center. She stood by the door like a mother about to walk into war. He took one look at her, then the note still swaying on the nail. His jaw set. She thought he'd say don't. He didn't. He stepped past her, picked up his rifle, and slung it over his shoulder. "Stay with the babies," he said. "I'll bring her back." "I'm coming too," Jean said. He didn't argue. He just turned once, gently took the sack from her hands, and set it aside. "I need you here. When I come back, she'll need to see you waiting." There was no softness in his tone, but there was something stronger. A trust that wrapped around her like a blanket. She nodded. Chaska kissed the twins, then reached out, hesitated, and touched Jean's cheek with the back of his fingers. Then he was gone. The trail to Missouri was dry and brutal. Jean knew that. She'd traveled it once before, years ago, when she still believed laws meant protection. Now, it was a line drawn between love and power, and Chaska had chosen which side to stand on. Each hour, Jean walked the porch with the babies. fed them, sang to them. But her heart was pacing too, further and further away. 3 days passed. Then 4. The firewood ran low. She chopped it herself, split her thumb doing so, and bound it with her kerchief. On the 5th night, a rider came, not Chaska. A boy, barely 17, pale and shaking. He dismounted, held out a slip of paper with both hands. "She's alive," he said. "He sent me ahead." Jean tore open the note. "Delilah is safe. I found them outside Ash Hollow. I'll be home soon." There was a drop of blood on the corner. Her stomach clenched. "He didn't look hurt," the boy added quickly. But his hands, they were shaking. That night, Jean didn't sleep. She sat in the cradle room, holding one twin in each arm, rocking slowly. Her eyes never left the window. The wind howled like a warning. Just before dawn, she saw him. Chaska. On foot. Cloak torn. Lip split. One sleeve soaked in red. But he was carrying something, someone. Delilah. Wrapped in his coat, her arms around his neck, fast asleep. Jean dropped the babies in their crib so fast they startled. She ran barefoot across the yard. When she reached him, he didn't speak. Just set Delilah gently into her mother's arms like something precious and already promised. Jean crumpled, wrapping her arms around her daughter's small body, sobbing into her hair. Delilah stirred, blinked, then whispered, "I told them you'd come." Behind her, Chaska fell to one knee. Not from exhaustion. From something else. She looked at him. He shook his head slowly, breath shallow. "They called the sheriff. Said I was a thief. Said I'd taken what didn't belong." Jean touched his face. "You brought her back." "I didn't kill them," he said. "But I made sure they won't come again." In the distance, the sound of hooves. Jean's heart froze. "They followed you?" He didn't answer. Just stood slowly, steadied himself. Then said, "Go inside. Bar the door." But Jean didn't move. Because sometimes, when you've already lost everything once, you don't run anymore. You stand where love is. And you wait. The hooves drew closer. But so did something else. A fire had started in the fields. The wind carried the smoke toward town. And in the haze, a crowd gathered, not lawmen. Not yarrows. But townsfolk. Drawn by gossip. Drawn by the spectacle. And then, something unexpected. The preacher's son stepped forward. A boy barely older than Delilah. He looked at Jean. Then at Chaska. Then back again. And said, "If they come, they'll have to get through me." Another stepped forward. Then another. And Jean realized the town hadn't turned fully against her after all. Some hearts, like hers, had simply stayed quiet out of fear. But now they were speaking. And what they were saying was, enough. Enough lies. Enough stealing of children under the guise of civility. Enough punishment for love. Chaska looked at her once, then sat on the steps, exhaling like a man who had outrun hell. Delilah clung to Jean's neck and whispered, "Can I stay now?" Jean held her tighter. "Yes, baby. You're home." But inside her chest, Jean knew the final reckoning hadn't come yet. Not fully. And when it did, it would demand more than milk or silence. It would demand a name. A vow. And maybe, if the wind allowed, a wedding. Delilah stood barefoot in the red dirt, a daisy crown slipping sideways on her head. Her cheeks were sticky with plum juice, and her eyes squinted toward the barn where Jean was tying back her hair with a ribbon once considered lost. The morning was hot and still, heavy with waiting. Across the yard, Chaska leaned against the fence post, one arm in a sling, watching the horizon like it might still betray them. It had been 3 weeks since he carried Delilah home. 3 weeks since the town watched them stand against the old law and win. The sheriff never came. The Yarrow sent a lawyer's letter, sharp with threats and stamped with blood-colored ink, but it never reached Jean's hands. Chaska burned it unread. Instead, they built a new cradle. A wide one. Big enough for 3. The townsfolk's whispers had shifted from disgust to wary curiosity. Some still sneered, but others left small peace offerings, goat's milk, soap cakes, thread. The preacher's wife avoided Jean altogether now, which, in truth, was a gift. And when Mrs. Gray crossed the street to avoid her, Jean just smiled and tipped her bonnet like a lady with nothing left to prove. Still, Jean hadn't laughed. Not yet. The cabin was fuller now, babies crawling, Delilah singing nonsense to the chickens, and Chaska's quiet footsteps that somehow sounded like home. But Jean's ring finger stayed bare. Not from doubt. From fear. She didn't know how to carry love out in the open without waiting for someone to take it. Until one evening, just after supper, Chaska laid something on the table, not a ring, not a question, just his name carved into wood. A pendant. Smooth and simple. She picked it up. Her thumb traced the grooves. "I made it before I went for her," he said. She looked up. He added, "Didn't know if I'd come back. But if I didn't, I wanted you to have something to remind her of who brought her home." Jean stood very still. Then she turned, walked to the fire, and placed the pendant in the center of the mantel. She didn't wear it. Not yet. But it glowed there all the same, like a promise waiting to be spoken. Days passed. And then, one Sunday morning, the bell rang. Not the church bell. The front gate. She opened the door to find 3 women standing there, townswomen. One held a basket. Another, a folded white dress. The last, a spool of ribbon. Jean raised a brow. The tallest woman said, "We thought, maybe, you'd want to do it properly." She didn't answer. She just reached for the dress. An hour later, she stood in it. White, not for purity, but for peace. The fabric was rough muslin, stitched by women who once called her names but now seemed to understand the weight of a woman who kept feeding children that weren't hers. She walked barefoot into the field. Chaska was waiting near the willow where they'd first sat together, where he'd handed her Delilah's ribbon and said nothing because the words would have been too small. Delilah ran ahead, carrying a wildflower bouquet. The twins were in a woven cradle, cooing softly in the shade. Jean stopped in front of him. She didn't need a sermon. She didn't need a Bible. Just the wind, and this man, and the life they'd built quietly. Chaska looked at her like she was made of every evening he'd spent believing joy was for other men. "You sure?" he asked, voice rough with reverence. Jean nodded once. "Then take it," he said, and held out the pendant. She took it in both hands and slid it over her head. It settled between her collarbones like it had always belonged there. The onlookers, just a dozen or so townspeople, didn't clap. But they smiled. And some wept. Because something in that moment, in the rawness of it, felt holy. Later, back in the cabin, Jean washed the dust from her feet and fed the babies as Chaska lit the lanterns. Delilah fell asleep curled up with her new doll. The fire crackled like applause no one dared give. He sat beside her on the floor. "Do you know why I carved that name for you?" he asked. She shook her head, eyes half-lidded. "Because it isn't mine," he said. "Not just. It's yours now, too. Because you kept the babies alive. Because you didn't run. Because you built something where nothing was left." She looked at him, soft and unafraid now. "Say it," she whispered. He touched her face. Jean Chaska. It wasn't a full name. Not by law. Not by paper. But it was enough. She closed her eyes and smiled. And for the first time in years, she laughed. Not loud. Not long. Just the kind of laugh that rises up like water when the drought finally breaks. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and the cabin around them seemed to breathe. Outside, the land was still. The prairie stretched wide, generous. The wind carried no warnings, only the scent of cedar and warm earth. She'd taken his name like water. Not to be owned. To be known. To be trusted. And that, she would one day tell her daughter, is what love really means. Not grand gestures. Not white veils or rings or sermons. Just staying. Just saving. Just holding what the world said wasn't worth the trouble and calling it home. That night, the pendant glowed softly in the firelight, and the cradle slept full. And so did she.